What do former Nazis, free love, the Shah of Iran, anti-imperialism, Che Guevara, Muammar Gaddafi, and the East German Stasi all have in common? If this is the type of question that keeps you awake at night, well, you should probably talk to a professional, because let's be honest, that's not normal. But in a fantastic stroke of luck, we are going to answer that very question today, because in the twisted and complex tale of the German left-wing terrorist group Red Army faction, they all play a role. I'm your host David, and this week we are taking a look at the infamous group. This is the Cold War. In a continuation of our look at terrorism during the Cold War, we are examining the Red Army faction, or fraction, depending on which translation you use. The group, also called the Baader-Meinhof gang, or Baader-Meinhof group, was active from 1970 until 1998, although few, if any, of the original members survived through that whole period. Now, a couple of quick notes before we dive in. In our previous coverage of terrorism, we did try to avoid using terrorist names to deny them notoriety. Sadly, this is not possible when discussing the Red Army faction, as the personalities at the core of the group are integral to its history. We want to be clear though, we in no way endorse or wish to elevate these people who killed and maimed dozens of innocent people during their campaign of terror. Additionally, we need to note that the twisted path of the Red Army faction could fill several hours of content, and as we don't have the time for that level of detail, we won't be able to address every action or member of the RAF. Also, while most of the Red Army faction's actions are well documented, some events may well be apocryphal, but we have chosen to include them largely because they have not been disproven and have become staples of the group's legacy. We have endeavored to indicate which events are apocryphal in nature. So, with that out of the way, let's get to it. The Red Army faction emerged out of the turbulent 1960s, where youth movements and revolutionary groups were sweeping the globe. In West Germany, many young people viewed the previous generation's complicity in Nazi crimes with disdain and were inspired in equal measure by the call of new global voices seeking greater civil rights for oppressed peoples and righting the wrongs of the past. All of this, of course, was taking place against the background of global abhorrence of the US war in Vietnam. These various threads of counterculture wove together in Germany into the Außerparlamentarische Opposition, the Extra-Parliamentary Opposition, or APO for short. An alliance of left-wing groups and young people who rejected the traditional left-wing German parties, such as the SPD, and agitated for greater social justice within Germany and around the world. Beginning in 1967, a series of events pushed some elements of the German APO towards the extreme. The first of these was the appointment of Kurt Georg Kiesinger as Chancellor in 1966. Kiesinger had been a Nazi Party member and worked in the Foreign Office during the Second World War. His appointment was so controversial that at the Christian Democratic Union Party conference on November 7, 1967, activist Beate Klarsfeld slapped Kiesinger in the face on live television, screaming, "Nazi!" And Klarsfeld's protest was not the only one in 1967. In June of that year, the Shah of Iran, a US ally who was, rightfully it should be said, seen as a corrupt and brutal dictator, visited West Berlin. APO members and a variety of other groups protested, and the West German police in Berlin, at the time organized as a paramilitary reserve, severely mishandled the demonstration. Not only did they take a confrontational approach, but they allowed Iranian agents who had been flown in to cheer for the Shah and rough up demonstrators a free rein. In the course of the clashes, German student Benno Onsorg was shot and killed by a police officer. Subsequently, in 1968, a far-right extremist attacked one of the APO leaders, Rudi Deutschke, severely injuring him. After this event, the APO splintered, with many choosing to join the SPD and change it from within. However, other, more radical elements of the APO believed that revolution was around the corner and they needed to serve as its vanguard. In 1968, some former APO members set fire to a department store. Among those responsible was Andreas Baader, who was caught and convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, Baader's friends resolved to free him and launched a new underground struggle for liberation. This included Ulrike Meinhof, a young journalist, Gudrun Ensslin, and Horst Mahler. Baader, exercising his rights to have access to research materials, began visiting the German Central Institute for Social Issues to do research. There, his compatriots attacked his police escort. The group escaped, but while doing so, an institute employee was seriously injured. Supposedly, Ulrike Meinhof was not supposed to flee with the group and was supposed to remain behind to serve as their above-ground voice for propaganda, but following the violence, Meinhof joined the flight and went underground with the rest of the group. By the next month, the group, which had grown to include 20 members, published their first call to action in the anarchist magazine Agit 883 with an article entitled "Build the Red Army." It declared open war on the German state and said that the Red Army faction, who the German state was referring to as the Baader-Meinhof gang, would lead a workers' revolution. Transiting through France and aided by sympathetic French leftists, the Red Army faction flew to Jordan and resided in a camp affiliated with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There, they received military and weapons training, as well as bomb-making instructions. One story for the time in the camp was that the female members of the RAF shocked and appalled their culturally more conservative Palestinian hosts by sunbathing naked, resulting in a near fistfight between PLO and RAF members, as the RAF contingent, especially Baader, lectured the PLO on the ideals of Marxism, which the PLO nominally ascribed to. The situation was smoothed over as the RAF returned to Germany in the fall. It is believed that they obtained weapons and documents from the Stasi, the East German secret police, who saw no reason not to destabilize their Western rivals. The RAF then embarked on a series of bank robberies and thefts to acquire resources to fund their cause. Living underground, the group used false documents and identities, paying in cash and driving stolen vehicles with false registrations. It's very likely that Stasi's support for the group was one of the key factors in allowing them to operate in West Berlin, crossing into East German territory on false papers, and being able to hide out there. In 1971, however, they published their strategy, the Urban Guerrilla Project, or Urban Guerrilla Concept, depending on translation, which laid out their objective to wage war on capitalism throughout West Germany and announced that none of the group would ever consent to capture, thus declaring their willingness to kill police officers attempting to detain them. Throughout 1971, one RAF member, 2 police officers, and several civilians were killed as a result of this strategy. In at least one case, a civilian was killed by a police after being mistaken for an RAF member. Now, the RAF wasn't content with just bank robberies, and in May of 1971, they launched their May Offensive, which saw a series of bombings across Germany, striking targets in Frankfurt am Main, Augsburg, Munich, Karlsruhe, Hamburg, and Heidelberg. Targets included police stations, a judge, a publisher, and US Army installations, including the headquarters of the US Army in Europe and V Corps. The bombings injured 70 and killed 6 people, including US Army Colonel Paul Blomqvist. 3 other US soldiers were among the dead. The bombings led to both domestic and international pressure for the German state to act. On May 31, 1972, German authorities mobilized most of the nation's law enforcement agencies to set up thousands of roadblocks. While initially not successful, the saturation of police led to 3 RAF members, including Baader, being cornered by police. Baader and his accomplice, Holger Mainz, engaged in a lengthy shootout until the terrified Mainz surrendered wearing only his underwear. Baader was wounded by gunfire and subsequently arrested. Following this, other senior members of the RAF were also arrested. Meinhof and an accomplice were reported to authorities by a left-wing organizer with whom they had attempted to find shelter. At this point in the story, it's worth noting some of the RAF organizational strengths and weaknesses that had allowed it to sustain its campaign as long as it did. The senior leadership of the RAF were all known to each other and had extensive connections in both the German and global left-wing communities. Other members who joined, having been recommended through these networks, often used pseudonyms and operated in small groups, coordinated and supplied by the leadership group. Thus, the RAF was a classic cell-structured organization, where no one had a full organizational chart or knew the extent of its membership or source of supply. The RAF, as we mentioned, received training and support from other left-wing militant organizations, and very likely the Stasi, as well as perhaps even the KGB. Yet, one of the most vital assets the RAF was able to take advantage of was the broader German above-ground left-wing community. It was among these people that it drew its recruits, although the organization likely never numbered more than 20 to 40 people at most. These people distributed its propaganda and hid out among the population. When Meinhof knocked on a door of a left-wing organizer, she expected to be able to find shelter with no questions asked as soon as she identified herself as a fellow leftist, although she did not give her actual name or mention the RAF. However, she was reported to the police because the RAF actions had caused a deep rift in the German left-wing movement between those who supported the RAF and those who were horrified by the violence. So, in June of 1972, the whole leadership of the RAF was in custody and the situation should have been resolved. Except, well, no. The RAF, through their lawyers, continued to agitate and publish, demanding status as prisoners of war and going on hunger strikes to protest being kept in highly secure, isolated conditions. Holger Meins died in custody in 1974, either from the hunger strike or possibly after being injured by frustrated guards who saw him and the rest of the RAF as cop killers. His death in the RAF agitation led to a demonstration at Meins' funeral of up to 5,000 people, thus demonstrating that the RAF still enjoyed some support. Between 1973 and 1974, the group was placed on trial, and they used the proceedings to further their agitation, protesting their solitary confinement. This led to the formation of the Committee Against Torture by about 30 to 40 RAF supporters who staged demonstrations on the group's behalf. Ultimately, though, the RAF, with the exception of Horst Mahler, who denounced the group and was ejected from it, were sentenced to life imprisonment by 1977. Yet, even as the first generation of the RAF were imprisoned and faced trial, the organization's so-called second generation became active. The second generation of the RAF was more well organized. Coordination by the imprisoned leadership of the group was facilitated via Siegfried Haag and Roland Mayer, the defense attorneys for the RAF leadership. New RAF members were recruited through contacts in the German far left, and they attempted to professionalize their organization with small commandos of 3 to 4 people taking action, while one commando member would coordinate supplies with an above-ground contact called a quartermaster, while another would take directives from the leadership. All members used pseudonyms and sought to isolate themselves from the rest of the organization. This was done in order to prevent their death or capture from impacting the larger organization. In 1975, RAF members working with the June 2nd movement, a co-aligned or possibly even affiliated group, took a German politician, Peter Lorenz, hostage and demanded the release of numerous prisoners, including the imprisoned RAF leadership. The German government agreed to release 5 people affiliated with both the June 2nd movement and the RAF, but this did not include any members of the senior leadership. The subsequent return to terrorism by these individuals convinced the government that hostage for prisoner exchanges were a fruitless policy which only encouraged further acts of terror. And this is exactly what happened on April 24, 1975, when 6 RAF members seized the West German embassy in Stockholm and demanded again the release of the RAF leadership. The action, taken outside of Germany's borders, shows how the RAF had continued to evolve into a transnational terrorist group. The terrorists murdered 2 diplomats, but then an accidental detonation of a bomb killed 2 of the 6 terrorists. The remaining 4 were arrested, and the remaining hostages escaped. The West German government refused to negotiate for the release of the senior RAF members, who were by now serving their life sentences. Now, never let it be said that the founding members of the RAF were moderates in their dedication to their movement. In what should only be seen as an act of fanaticism, they chose martyrdom over imprisonment. Meinhof killed herself in 1976, and then on October 18, 1977, the remaining senior leadership of the RAF, including Baader, killed themselves by various means, including using guns smuggled in by their lawyers. The so-called Death Night has for years been the subject of conspiracy theories, but no definitive evidence has ever been found that pointed towards the RAF being murdered. Indeed, the German state went to great lengths to confine the RAF in humane conditions, to discredit their allegations of mistreatment, and even RAF sympathizers have never been able to identify specific instances of abuse. French philosopher, the left-wing Jean-Paul Sartre, who visited the RAF in prison, even gave his impression of the founders. What an asshole that Baader is. The RAF founders believed wholeheartedly in their cause, and that the violence they caused was justified. Their suicide may well have been a final effort to remain relevant rather than spend the rest of their lives fading into obscurity. Of course, the suicides had their desired effects, and the second generation, inspired by martyrdom, remained active and fanatical as ever. They carried out several targeted killings and kidnappings, even attempting to murder the Supreme Allied Forces Commander Europe and future American Secretary of State Alexander Haig. The US military actually remained a favorite target of the RAF throughout the 1970s and 80s. An attempt on Commander-in-Chief of the US Army in Europe, General Frederick James Crozen, in 1981 injured 4 people when an RAF member fired an RPG at his car. 1981 also saw a bombing at Ramstein Air Base, which injured 14 people. RAF members murdered US servicemen Edward Pimentel in order to obtain his ID card, and subsequently carried out a bombing of the Rhine-Main Air Base, killing 2 and injuring 23. These attacks were part of the RAF new strategy, taken after its founders' deaths and the arrest of several second-generation leaders. They looked to undertake global revolution through cooperation with other left-wing groups in Europe, throughout Europe and around the world. Yet the 1980s did see the RAF suffer some major blows. The RAF quartermasters were identified, and dozens of caches of weapons, documents, and cash were seized. The German police managed to arrest several second-generation members, and others simply deserted, fleeing to East Germany. There was a third generation of the RAF members who remained active, but they were increasingly isolated even within left-wing circles, and their frequency of their attacks diminished. Most of the members remain unknown to this day, and most have escaped justice. Ultimately, what undid the RAF was its own violence, helped along by a shift within the German political establishment. Remember that the RAF began in part due to the backlash of young Germans at the role of former Nazis in government. Those on the left who opted to follow the non-violent path succeeded in returning the SPD to power in 1969, the first time since the 1930s. The rise of the SPD led to a series of grand coalitions that eased tensions and led to increased consensus in Germany. Additionally, many of the offenders of the Second World War had by this time either died or had begun to retreat from public life. The Soviet crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968 and the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and even the Cambodian genocide following the US withdrawal from Vietnam, helped to make the RAF devotion to revolution look more fanciful and denied them broad appeal. There is some indication that the KGB and Stasi directly sponsored the third generation of the RAF in order to undermine the SPD government and try to destabilize West Germany, but much of the material related to this was destroyed with the collapse of East Germany. The collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War denied the remaining RAF members their major source of support and political legitimacy. Their previous imagery of romantic revolutionaries had been undone by their violence and brutality. They were increasingly isolated and were more effectively targeted by an increasingly capable German law enforcement establishment. The third generation's leadership was killed or captured in a raid in 1993, the same year the RAF carried out its last bomb attack on the under-construction Vaterstadt prison. No one was injured in that attack. So the writing was on the wall. In 1998, the RAF published its last official communique. Almost 28 years ago, on May 14, 1970, the RAF was founded in a liberation action. Today, we are ending this project. The urban guerrilla in the form of the RAF is now history. This formally dissolved the organization, although German police continued to hunt for former members. Most recently, Daniela Kletta, a third-generation member, was arrested in February of 2024. So, where does this leave us? Well, during the course of its existence, the RAF was never larger than about 100 people. Of these, 28 were killed and dozens more imprisoned. Many of the others continued to elude the authorities to this day. The RAF killed 33 people and injured over 200 in service of a cause that may well have been lost from the beginning. Baader-Meinhof, Haag, Croissant, and all the others believed they could imitate revolutionaries like Che Guevara and Vladimir Lenin and instigate their own revolution with the aim, no doubt, of lofting themselves to power as the vanguard. We can wonder if the cause they truly believed in was revolution, or perhaps simply their own egos. Their legacy is fittingly not one of glorious revolution or romantic struggle, but as thieves, murderers, and thugs. Rather than work within a democratic system, they sought to engage in terrorism and violence, often harming innocent bystanders to the very detriment of their own cause. They never earned any type of broad support and never came close to instigating the changes they sought. Yet the story of the Baader-Meinhof gang, the RAF, is a story that is integral to the broader wave of terrorism and violence which grew out of the period we call the Cold War. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is tired of having to break up fights between topless Germans and various other revolutionary groups who are more modest in their dress. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.